Hey guys, Butts here, and today I want to talk about Manastorm Cyclone. Uh, I can quickly show a map showcase, and then I discuss the build. So the general idea is that with Manastorm and this new instant leech, Manastorm was buffed last league, by the way. But I played Venom Gyre with the last league, and it was pretty fun. But the general idea is if you play like a really fast hitting skill or a skill that shotguns, you can quickly dumpster all your mana, which gives you tons of flat. Like I go from like I get 20 to 80,000 flat lightning damage for 4 seconds after I spend all my mana, and then if I use a fast hitting skill, which is why I'm using Cyclone, you can quickly gain all that mana back. The general idea of using Cyclone was Cyclone does terrible damage. Just I don't know if everybody knows that current Cyclone is just a very low DPS skill. You generally have to play Shockwave if you want to have reasonable damage or crazy amounts of investment. So the idea was, is Manastorm strong enough alongside this to make Cyclone deal decent damage? And just to get it out of the way, this build did not turn out very well. But I would like to do more videos about the builds that don't work out, just because I think it's still going to be helpful to people, and maybe it'll help you not fall into the same pitfalls that I did when making the build. So I can give you a quick showcase of how this looks. So you can see Frostblink, spend all my mana, and then pretty much just instantly gain it right back. Depends on how tanky the mob is and how much damage you actually deal, because the range on Manastorm is very real. So it will not always be that way. But in general, it's generally like you get your mana back almost instantly. And if you want to sit in the same place, like let's do this. You can do something like Clarity. Like I turn a Clarity on and off. If I'm like bossing and I can't actually move, is the idea. You can use like something like Blood Rage or I guess really just. I mean, there's not a ton. There's really like Corrupting Fever, Blood Rage, and all that stuff. Side note, I would love to have a First to Strike, Last to Fall, Forbidden Jewels for this build and use Corrupting Fever. But anyways, back to clearing. So you end up in awkward spots like that where you spend all your mana, and then there's nothing to hit, so you're just like running around with like very minimal. Because this build doesn't scale mana regen really hard because it doesn't really make a ton of sense to because of your leech, just like investment-wise. Initially, I was using, what's it called? Shavron's Revelation, but you get in this really awkward spot where you would Frostblink and then literally have no mana to actually Cyclone, so you had to life tap it, and it would create this really, really uncomfortable play pattern. And the cost of skills went up a ton this league, so like life tapping a Cyclone that's hitting like 10 or like 15 times a second actually costs like a ton of mana. But yeah, so that's generally the build, and I can just discuss the rest of it, but that's kind of the general idea. Is you just use instant skills to get your Manastorm, and then fast hitting skill to get all your mana back. I'll kind of go over why I think the build did not really turn out the way I would have liked. A big one that you don't see in this video is we're using a really fast hitting skill, right? That's the whole build around this. And since I'm not using Ralakesh and Patience, I actually need to gain the charges. So we're using Poacher's Mark to get our frenzies, and then we're getting endurance charge on melee stun to get our endurance charges, which works when mapping. On bosses, particularly on like pinnacles, we do not hit hard enough to do this. So I have to use Enduring Cry in Urgent Orders, which feels pretty bad because these only last like 10 seconds, and we're not scaling like Warcry speed or anything like that. You could use Ralakesh to get around this, but that made it a little bit awkward. Other things that are a little awkward is, I mean, honestly, that's like the big one, right? But the other thing is the damage just feels a little less than I was hoping for, and a lot of that is like your damage can feel really spiky, right? Because like this cannot be overstated, right? Like 20 to 82,000, like the range on that is ridiculous. So like sometimes you'll feel like you hit like a fucking god, and then other times you feel like you hit like wet paper, right? That's just the nature of this. That's like why it's pretty unreasonable, I think, to use this alongside No Source of Lucky, either this or I forget which Timeless Jewel it is, where it's the one that has Balboa on it. I think it's America's one, where if you're not wearing a helmet, your damage with critical strikes is lucky. So you can do that as well. But essentially, I think you kind of need to have rolled twice if all your damage is coming from this, because otherwise you can't just deal 20 damage to a mob. you're just not going to kill them. And that you can definitely run into that with this build. Like even though you hit really frequently, every once in a while, you just like hit and then you just low roll like 3 or 4 times, and you're just like, man, does my build just not do damage? And then the next pack you just like one tap array, you're just like, well, So it can feel a little bit spikier than you'd like. The other thing is it's kind of difficult to actually use all of this ES because I want to use this shield, and Crown of the Undereye is just incredible for builds like this that are not Hierophant, so they don't get this transfiguration of body. So we were using Energy Leech, and then Volatility. This probably makes this problem, I would say this makes this problem worse, but not really, right? Because like lowering the 20 flat lightning doesn't really matter. So this Volatility is just a crazy support for like a pure lightning build like this. That's not getting its, that has the normal lightning range, not something like Arcane Cloak that gives you all this flat. Like that's the thing, is like your damage is relatively consistent when your Arcane Cloak is up, but it's not always going to be up. I think we have like 75% uptime on this build. Crafting Axe was pretty tough, and this enchant is incredibly expensive for the power of this build. So that's kind of where I'm at on it. Is I like a lot of what's going on here. Someone in chat recommended the Agua Mortis. I feel like this item is probably pretty slept on, and I have not considered it in a long time, but if you're frost blinking everywhere, you're going to have pretty good uptime on this, and then it's going to be, if you're doing pure lightning damage, it adds a ton of damage. These are like 10C, so pretty cheap to pick up. What else can I talk about? I think this is pretty interesting. Since you're a big mana build, you have a pretty low life total. It's pretty easy to sustain like 10 to 20 like stacks of Weeping Wounds, just because your actual life total is relatively low. And we have instant leech to like cover that up. Like in general, like I like when I'm mapping, if I run into a rare, I can press my tincture, and then I usually forget to turn it off till I have about 20 stacks, because then your health's like actually like draining. But this is a pretty cool way to do this. You probably sustain this quite a bit farther if you use something like Restless Ward, since you get the flat life regen from endurance charges. That would counteract this quite a bit, especially if you use like a reduced mana burn rate as opposed to increased effect like I'm using here. I would probably not recommend that, but yeah, the other things we're doing with the build is, since we have, we need to take this for this to actually get our mana leech, and then if you spend 2 additional points, we can just get the instant leech on our, so this gives us instant life leech, this gives us instant ES leech, so we can really help maintain our triple pool, very similar to how like Hyro builds are built, where they have like a, I mean, they generally don't leech their mana, but unless they're cock, but they generally like can leech both of these instant, which in our case, we're leeching all 3 mana pools instantly, and then mana 100% of the time, like or 100% of leech. And since we're getting all of our leech instantly like that, we can then use Strength of Blood, which gives us a ton of fizz mitigation. On top of that, we get Fortify from our chest. We have like the 8 endurance charges. The build in general should be really tanky, but on bosses, the endurance charges, like I said, like when if you're actually doing like pinnacles, the endurance charges are down quite a bit, and between that and the damage feeling like really spiky, just as how Manastorm is going to kind of always feel realistically, unless you have like really high uptime on another source of flat to give you like reasonable damage when it's down, the build's going to feel a little inconsistent, even if the POB is going to be like, wow, that's like crazy high damage, but it's like sometimes it's just not. It's just there is more high variance in how much damage you deal in this than any other kind of build. Just be warned, I guess, if you play something like this to account for that. Yeah, so last thing I want to touch on, I know I mentioned Cyclone because it's fascinating skill, but I would say, to me more than anything, it was to take a skill that is really well loved, and I would say for good reason, because it's really fun to play when it actually deals damage, right? But and then try to fix it with something that gives a ton of damage. So it's a little disappointing, but like in current PoE, you can do Cyclone with Cast on Crit, Shockwave, Enable Holy Relic, Mjolnir. There's like a million different things you can do with Cyclone, just not if Cyclone is the thing that deals damage, unfortunately. So that's what I was trying to fix. Like, you could pretty much just triple the damage of this build if you use something like Splitting Steel, Lightning Strike, Molten Strike, even Volcanic Fissure, since we're using an axe. We're right by point blank. But yeah, I was hoping that this name would not be ironic, but in hindsight, kind of is, because it still just does not deal enough damage, unfortunately. I'm sure with more investment you could make it work, but I guess this ain't it. I still really hope that this was informative, either so you can use the shell on something else, you can tune this build, or just maybe avoid the pitfalls that I ran into in making it. Well, either way, thank you guys for stopping by, and I hope the next one does a little bit more damage. Later.